In the immediate post-war years, there were widespread fears of a return to depression, but fueled by cheap energy, increased worker productivity, and government programs like the GI Bill of Rights, the economy began a spectacular expansion that lasted from 1950 to 1970. This burst of affluence transformed American industry and society, and particularly drew more women into the workforce. Footloose Americans migrated to the sunbelts of the South and West and to the growing suburbs, leaving the northeastern cities with poorer populations. Families grew rapidly, as the baby boom created a population bulge that would last for decades. The Yalta Agreement near the end of the World War II left major issues undecided and created controversy over post-war relations with the Soviet Union. With feisty Truman in the White House, the two new superpowers soon found themselves at odds over Eastern Europe, Germany, and the Middle East. The Truman Doctrine announced military aid and an ideological crusade against international communism. The Marshall Plan provided economic assistance to starving and communist-threatened Europe, which soon joined the United States in the NATO military alliance. The Cold War and revelations of spying aroused deep fears of communist subversion at home that culminated in McCarthy's witch hunting. Fear of communist advances abroad and social change at home generated national and local assaults on many people perceived to be different. Issues of the Cold War and civil rights fractured the Democratic Party three ways in 1948, but a gutsy Truman campaign overcame the divisions to win a triumphant underdog victory. The Communist Chinese won a civil war against the nationalists. North Korea invaded South Korea, and the Americans and Chinese joined in fighting the Seesaw War to a bloody stalemate. MacArthur's insubordination and threats to expand the war to China led Truman to fire him. Using the new medium of television to enhance his great popularity, Grandfatherly Ike was ideally suited to soothe an America badly shaken by the Cold War in Korea. Eisenhower was slow to go after Joseph McCarthy, but the tumultuous bubble finally burst. Eisenhower also reacted cautiously to the beginnings of the civil rights movement, but sent troops to Little Rock to enforce court orders. While his domestic policies were moderately conservative, they left most of the New Deal in place. Despite John Dulles' tough talk, Eisenhower's foreign policies were also generally cautious. He avoided military involvement in Vietnam, although aided Diem, and pressured Britain, France, and Israel to resolve the Suez Crisis. He also refused to intervene in the Hungarian Revolt and sought negotiations to thaw the frigid Cold War. Dealing with Nikita Khrushchev proved difficult, but as Sputnik, the Berlin crisis, the U-2 incident, and the Fidel Castro's Cuban Revolution all kept Cold War tensions high. In a tight election, Senator John Kennedy defeated Eisenhower's vice president, Richard Nixon, by calling for the country to get moving again by more vigorously countering the Soviets. American society grew ever more prosperous in the Eisenhower era, as science, technology, and the Cold War fueled burgeoning new industries like electronics and aviation. Women joined the movement into the increasingly white-collar workforce and chafed at widespread restrictions they faced. A new consumer culture centered around television fostered a new ethic of leisure and enjoyment, including more open expressions of sexuality in popular entertainment. Intellectuals and artists criticized the focus on private affluence rather than the public good. Jewish, African American, and Southern writers had a striking new impact on American culture. Kennedy's New Frontier initiatives bogged down in congressional stalemate. Cold War confrontations over Berlin and Russian missiles in Cuba created threats of war. Countering Third World communism through a flexible response led the administration into dangerous involvement in Vietnam and elsewhere. Johnson succeeded Kennedy and overwhelmingly defeated Goldwater. The black movement for integration and voting rights won great victories. Johnson used his huge congressional majorities to push through a mass of liberal Great Society legislation. Northern black ghettos erupted in violence amid calls for black power. Johnson escalated military involvement in the Dominican Republic and Vietnam. As the number of troops and casualties grew without producing military success, dovish protests against the war gained strength. Political opposition forced Johnson not to seek re-election, and the deep Democratic divisions over the war allowed Nixon to win the White House. Nix's Vietnamization policy reduced American ground participation in the war, but his Cambodia invasion sparked massive protest. Nixon's journeys to Communist Moscow and Beijing established a new rapprochement with these powers. In domestic policy, Nixon and the Supreme Court promoted affirmative action and environmental protection. The 1972 election victory and the ceasefire in Vietnam were negated when Nixon became bogged down in the Watergate scandal and congressional protests over the secret bombing of Cambodia, which led to the War Powers Act. The Middle East War of 1973 and the Arab oil embargo created energy and economic difficulties that lasted through the decade. Americans gradually awoke to their costly and dangerous dependence on Middle Eastern oil and began to take tentative steps toward conservation and alternative energy sources. Non-elected Gerald Ford took after Watergate forced Nixon to resign. The Communist Vietnamese finally overran the South Vietnamese government in 1975. The defeat in Vietnam added to a general sense of disillusionment with society and a new sense of limits on American power. The civil rights movement fractured, and divisive issues of buzzing and affirmative action enhanced racial tensions. The most successful social movement was feminism, which achieved widespread social breakthroughs, though failing to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. Campaigning against Washington and Watergate, outsider Jimmy Carter proved unable to master Congress or the economy once he took office. The Camp David Agreement brought peace between Egypt and Israel, but the Iranian Revolution led to new energy troubles. The invasions of Afghanistan and the holding of American hostages in Iran added to Carter's woes. Reagan led Republicans to sweeping victories in 1980 and 1984 over divided and demoralized Democrats. Riding a conservative national tide, Reagan pushed both his supply-side economic program of lower taxes and the new right social policies, especially opposition to affirmative action, abortion, and drugs. These policies brought economic recovery and lower inflation, as well as record budget deficits that severely restricted big government. The Supreme Court under Reagan and his successor George Bush became increasingly conservative, while the confirmation hearings of Justice Clarence Thomas highlighted issues of sexual harassment. Reagan revived the Cold War confrontation with the Soviet Union and engaged the United States in assertive military support for anti-leftist forces in Latin America and elsewhere. The ratcheting up of military spending, along with the attempted reforms led by Mikhail Gorbachev, contributed to the unraveling of communism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union in 1989 to 1991. With America as the only remaining superpower, George Bush led an international coalition to victory in the Persian Gulf War, but the Middle East remained a dangerous tinderbox despite new efforts to resolve the Israel-Arab conflict. The dynamic young baby boomer Bill Clinton defeated Bush in 1992 and promoted an ambitious reform agenda within the context of his centrist New Democratic ideology. Clinton's stumbles over health care reform and foreign policy opened the door to aggressive conservative Republicans, who gained control of Congress in 1994 for the first time in 50 years, advocating a contract with America. But the Newt Gingrich-led Republicans overreaching enabled Clinton to revive and win a second term in 1996. In his second term, Clinton downplayed reform and successfully claimed the political middle ground on issues like welfare reform, affirmative action, smoking, and gun control. A booming economy created budget surpluses and encouraged Clinton's efforts toward ending international trade barriers. Conflicts in the Middle East and the Balkans led to American diplomatic and military involvements, with mixed results. A series of scandals culminating in the Monica Lewinsky affair led to Clinton's impeachment and acquittal in 1999. Texas Governor George Walker Bush defeated Clinton's Vice President Al Gore in a contested cliffhanging election in 2000 that was finally decided by a Supreme Court decision as the fourth president elected in American history to lose popular vote. George W. Bush entered the Oval Office promising to bring to Washington the conciliatory skills he had fine-tuned as Republican governor of Texas, where he had worked well with the Democratic majority in the state legislature. But as president, Bush proved to be more of a divider than a uniter, focusing on social issues like abortion, a constitutional amendment to ban same-sex marriage, embryonic stem cell research, the environment, and add to that an increasing budget deficit. These polarizing policies both reflected and deepened the cultural chasm that divided American society. On September 11, 2001, suicidal terrorists slammed two hijacked airliners into the Twin Towers of New York City's World Trade Center. A third plane crashed into the Pentagon, and a fourth plane was forced down by its heroic passengers in rural Pennsylvania. Osama bin Laden had been identified as the mastermind behind the World Trade Center attack. And when the Taliban refused to turn over bin Laden to American officials, Bush ordered a massive military campaign against Afghanistan. Within 3 months, American and Afghani rebel forces had overthrown the Taliban but failed to find bin Laden. The fear of future threats led to American officials to take aggressive and controversial actions following the events of September 11th. Congressional passage of the USA Patriot Act, creation of the Department of Homeland Security, rounding up and trying suspected terrorists in military tribunals, where the usual rules and procedures do not apply, and the controversial invasion and occupation of Iraq. In the 1980s and 1990s, the American culture and economy underwent dynamic changes from an age of heavy industry to an age of computerized information and mass culture. Science and education increasingly drove the new forms of wealth, and growth of new media and the internet helped fuel a new economy linked with the rest of the world. The benefits of the new wealth did not reach everyone, however, as the gaps between those with education and those without contributed to an increasingly severe inequality in Americans' wealth and income. The decades-long movement into the workforce of women, including mothers of young children, opened ever wider doors of opportunity and contributed to changes in men's roles as well as in family life. Women's concern for issues of health and childcare created a persistent political gender gap between Democrats and Republicans in national elections. With fewer families being formed and fewer children being born to native-born Americans, the population began to age and the elderly became a potent lobbying force. A vast new wave of immigration, especially from Asia and Latin America, brought newcomers seeking economic opportunity and liberties unavailable in their homelands. Hispanics, Asians, and Indians all asserted their own identity and pride and made areas like the American Southwest a bicultural zone. The problems of poverty, increasingly concentrated in inner cities ringed by affluent suburbs, remained stubborn and frustrating to millions of Americans, including many minorities. The African American community made great strides in education, politics, and other areas, but there was a growing gap between the upwardly mobile and those left behind. America's cities were plagued by problems of drugs and crime, but the soaring crime rates of the 1980s were reversed and turned downward in the 1990s. In the same decade, many cities began to show signs of renewal. American culture remained incredibly dynamic and inventive, but both in high culture and pop culture. The new voices of Westerners, women, African Americans, Asians, and others were increasingly influential and popular, contributing to the variety, energy, and humor of U.S. society. Beginning with the post-war abstract expressionist movement in New York City, American visual arts and architecture also led worldwide revolutions in taste and transformed the nature of